Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, victory at last in Iraq.
Pivotal election that's being held as a success.
That's how some people in the American news media see it. If you're a whistleblower looking for somewhere to tell your story, then WikiLeaks is the website for you. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. No, actually, they're not. And 24-hour news channels.
Desperate attempt to fill 24 hours of programming here.
Filling the news hole with whatever it takes. As the Iraqi polls closed last week, we at The Listening Post analyzed election coverage within the country and the state of the media there. This week, we're looking at the same story, but switching our focus to the narrative on Iraq in the American media. It is fair to say that U.S. news outlets have, in editorial terms, been all over the place on the Iraq war. Even the so-called liberal media were hawkish during the run-up. Then many outlets turned against the war when it was going badly. But now some of them and their opinion makers are changing their tune. They're going back to where they started. We're zeroing in on two pieces in particular: a cover story on Newsweek magazine that talked of victory in Iraq, and a column by Thomas Friedman, a foreign policy specialist at the New York Times. Our starting point this week is Baghdad, with a story that's being scripted in Washington, D.C. and being told in America and around the world. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times was not the only editorial voice in America to support the Iraq War. He was just one of the most influential because of who he is and where his work is published.
Many of the columnists, the Thomas Friedmans, the Fareed Zakarias, the George Packers of the New Yorker, you know, these guys are supposed to be these genius foreign policy thinkers, right? And they got the biggest foreign policy question of their generation completely wrong.
As the Times' foreign policy columnist, Thomas Friedman is considered a must-read for many Americans, particularly policymakers in Washington.
He's been able to transform himself into kind of a condenser of the conventional elite wisdom on the Middle East.
What Thomas Friedman writes helps shape the debate in Washington, D.C., helps shape the debate policymakers are having.
In the column he published on the Iraq election entitled "It's Up to Iraqis Now, Good Luck," Friedman wrote, "Of all the pictures I saw, my favorite was the Iraqi expatriate mother voting in Michigan, holding up her son to let him stuff her ballot into the box. I loved that picture." But Michigan is a long way and a far cry from Baghdad.
I do see some irony in the fact that Tom Friedman chose a picture of Iraqi refugees voting in Detroit. It just brings to mind that there remains a huge refugee situation. 5 million people, it's estimated, were displaced. This policy of invasion and occupation is one that is simply not going to be vindicated, no matter what people like Tom Friedman would like to believe.
It's a fitting example of the distance of his thinking. What's the woman in Michigan got to worry about? She's not going to be facing the consequences of what's gone on there. She lives in Michigan. All the people that live in Baghdad, in Basra, in Kirkuk, they live with these things daily. And to Friedman, it's all one grand abstraction.
Friedman went on to write, "President Bush's gut instinct that this region craved and needed democracy was always right. Some argue that nothing that happens in Iraq will ever justify the costs. Historians will sort that out."
Tom Friedman's column is, unfortunately, I think, symbolic of the generally cavalier attitude he's had about this from the very beginning. The American people understand that we cannot go about the world just starting wars, invading, and occupying countries. However, our elite media, Tom Friedman being a perfect example, seem to think that we can.
Friedman talks a lot about democracy in the column, but nowhere does he mention the weapons of mass destruction that were never found, or the 9/11 attacks that precipitated the war, even though back in 2003, terrorism was in the forefront of Friedman's thinking and his writing.
The terrorism bubble that basically built up over the 1990s said, flying airplanes into the World Trade Center, that's okay. Having your preachers say that's okay, that's okay. And what they needed to see was American boys and girls going house to house from Basra to Baghdad and basically saying, you think this bubble fantasy, we're just going to let it grow? Well, suck on this.
The problem, of course, with the thinking there is that there wasn't anyone in any homes from Basra to Baghdad that had anything to do at all with the 9/11 attacks. you may as well have been kicking in the doors of people in Minneapolis.
We could have hit Saudi Arabia. It was part of that bubble. Could have hit Pakistan. We hit Iraq because we could.
This, I think, correctly represented the way that the Bush administration viewed the world. And it represented, I think, an unfortunate tendency of many in the media to react to 9/11 in a very defensive and a very belligerent manner.
The New York Times has a reputation in the U.S. for being ideologically liberal. So does Newsweek magazine, whose cover story and splashy headline also attracted attention, not all of it good.
I thought Newsweek magazine's cover that said "Victory at Last" was just very embarrassing for the magazine to even put up there. I don't use the word propaganda lightly, but it seemed to me that was propaganda. What it was meant to do was to tell Americans, hey, look, guys, we won, even though the facts don't really back that case up at all.
The Newsweek article was not quite as triumphal as the headline on the cover, but it's Newsweek.
Your cover of Newsweek, Victory at Last?
So it caught the attention of news channels that back in 2002, 2003 also backed the war.
Our reporting has shown that, in fact, there is a level of stability and a kind of political culture taking hold. What General Petraeus did and what President Bush came to does seem to have worked.
It's a stunning story.
It really is.
However, the Newsweek editor did face one challenging question, just one.
What happens if 3 or 4 months down the road they can't put a government together?
Then we will say, victory still to come.
Yeah.
That was just a joke, but it contained a disturbing element of truth. Some of the American media took a one-day exercise in Iraqi democracy and turned it into much more than that.
Pivotal election that's being held as a success.
The process is being called a success.
There's a strong desire in the United States to rewrite the narrative of the war, to give the war a happy ending.
That is a success.
A success?
Most folks think that it's been a big success.
I do see the narrative of the war shifting among the elite media who played a very significant role in selling the war in the first place. I think this narrative of late-coming victory in Iraq is more a result of the elite media's need to rehabilitate their own reputations than of anything else.
However, the Iraq story, with so many killed, millions of refugees, all that destruction of property and lives, is so much bigger than anyone's reputation. At least it should be.
Here's the danger. The danger is that if we convince ourselves in Washington, D.C. that we had a victory in Iraq, that will make it easier for us in the future to launch other wars that might be ill-advised. And I think that's the real danger.
We'll do this all again. In 5 years, we'll be sitting here talking about how can the United States save the Iran policy. So it's very, very important, I think, for the media to be held to account on what they got wrong and what they're still not seeing.
Politicians and public figures are notorious for rewriting history, especially their own. This is a case of columnists and media outlets doing the same. The difference is the media have hours of airtime and barrels of ink with which to do it. Here's how our Global Village voices see the ever-changing story of Iraq in the American media.
Unfortunately, many in the mainstream media don't have a clue, and I say that as a journalist myself. They often want to go in with just a few sound bites and a few B-roll footages, pushing their own agenda. Instead of reporting, they're more advertising their particular point of view.
I think it's important to remember that people like Tom Friedman, were either cheerleaders for the war or really didn't come out against it, even though they should have known better. And they were really part of this kind of axis of arrogance and ignorance. The press was supposed to be the bulwark against this. And I think people like Friedman know this, and so they're trying to find any possible shred of positivity in Iraq.
If you'd like to make your voice heard on our viewer feedback platform and you have the technology, the best way to get in touch is through Facebook and Twitter. Look for the Listening Post page on those sites where we've already got thousands of viewers signed up. We'll let you know what stories we're working on so you can weigh in as one of our Global Village voices. Or you can get with the program by reaching us through our email address, listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. They say those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and that's what happened on Georgian television this past week. This newsreader on Imedi TV reported that Russian forces had invaded Georgia again, that the Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili might have been killed, and that Georgia's opposition party was now in charge. But the report was just a simulation of what Imedi TV thought could happen if there was another invasion. It used pictures from 2008 when the Russians really did invade, giving the report an authentic look. Imedi told its viewers at the beginning and the end of the broadcast that it was reporting fake news. The problem was that many viewers say they didn't hear that and thought the broadcast was real. Georgian news agencies reported some panic in the capital, Tbilisi, that mobile phone networks and emergency services were jammed with calls. Now replace the fictitious Russians with imaginary Martians, and this story is strikingly similar to the War of the Worlds broadcast on the American radio network CBS in 1938. That show simulated an invasion from Mars, but failed to make that clear to its listeners and confused and scared people. The civil war in Sri Lanka is over, so are the elections, but according to Amnesty International, journalists there still have reason to feel threatened. According to a report by Lanka Newsweb, there is a list thought to have been compiled by Sri Lankan intelligence of 35 leading journalists and NGO workers in the country. Amnesty International called it a media hit list, a who's who of journalists opposed to the government. It took a few days, but the Sri Lankan government has denied the existence of such a list. However, Amnesty International called it a deliberate effort to intimidate and harass journalists. Some of the people allegedly on that list have appeared here on the Listening Post, such as Paikiasati Saravanamuthu of the Center for Policy Alternatives. And from the new media side of things, there is the creator of the Ground Views website, Sanjana Hatatua. He has been a regular contributor to our show as one of our Global Village voices. It continues to be open season on journalists in Mexico. 8 of them have been kidnapped over the past 2 weeks. They were all taken in Reynosa, a northern region. Of the 8 reporters abducted, 1 body has already turned up, showing clear signs of torture. 2 survivors have been released, and 5 are still missing. The media have been under increasing threat in the Latin American country as the cartels there gain more and more control of the cocaine traffic coming out of Colombia, heading to the U.S. Reynosa is just across the border from Texas. As one Mexican columnist put it, journalism is dead in Reynosa. The Academy Award-winning actor Sean Penn went on American television last week saying that if U.S. journalists don't stop lying about Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, they should be put in jail. Hugo Chavez has been democratically elected 3 times, and Penn says he's tired of U.S. media outlets, including the Washington Post, routinely calling Chavez a dictator when they have no evidence to support that.
Who do you know here that's gone through 14 of the most transparent elections in the globe and been elected democratically as Hugo Chavez?
Penn went on to tell Bill Maher on Maher's HBO show that enough is enough.
There should be a bar by which one goes to prison for these kinds of lies.
We're back after the break with a look at a website that has become the scourge of secretive governments, badly behaved corporations, and libel lawyers everywhere. Welcome back. In January 2007, a website called WikiLeaks made its debut on the World Wide Web. It was unlike any website that had come before it. WikiLeaks was there, it said, because it wanted people to upload their secrets. Not just any secrets, confidential information relating to political corruption, corporate fraud, even war crimes. In the 3 years that it's been on the web, WikiLeaks is said to have produced more journalistic scoops than most newspapers produce in 3 decades. That has not been an accident of good fortune. WikiLeaks is aggressive about cultivating and protecting its group of whistleblowers, dissidents, and political sources. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on a website that's made the Internet underground the place to go for news exclusives.
Legal injunctions, financial pressure, physical threats. Censorship tactics used by governments and corporations are persistent and effective. For those with access to sensitive secret documents, WikiLeaks was the outlet they'd been waiting for.
All over the world there is important information that has been suppressed. That has always been true.
It's for people who want to leak stuff, for whistleblowers, they can be confident that their anonymity is guaranteed and that everyone who they might want to see it will be able to see it.
WikiLeaks is essentially run by freedom of information fundamentalists, and they print and publish documents and journalism that other people are not prepared to publish.
One of those documents was the Kroll Report. Commissioned in 2004 by Kenyan President Mwai Kibaki, the investigation's brief was to calculate the extent of corruption by the government of former President Daniel Arap Moi. The answer unearthed by the investigators was $2 billion.
The Kibaki government had been elected to clean up the corruption in Kenya that existed under the Moi regime. The report, the Kroll Report, was suppressed and never entered the public domain. We released that only 2 months before the election.
The Kroll Report established for a fact the corruption Kenyans had always suspected. The news stirred up an already angry electorate. But WikiLeaks is about more than just breaking the news. Sometimes it's the only way to keep the news in the public domain.
This is where toxic waste from a rich Western company was illegally dumped.
In May 2009, Britain's BBC aired a report about the dumping of toxic waste in Abidjan in the Ivory Coast.
Nothing but disaster.
Trafigura, a Swiss-based company with offices in the UK, denied the material it was shipping out to the Ivory Coast was toxic. It sued the BBC for libel. 4 months later, it silenced the Guardian newspaper from reporting on an internal commission's findings, which showed the material was indeed toxic.
Trafigura, they commissioned scientific consultants to write a report about what they thought had happened after thousands of people in the Ivory Coast went to hospital complaining they got ill. When we got hold of the report, they went to court and got an injunction banning us from publishing it. They also banned us from revealing that they banned us.
But Trafigura's injunction on the Guardian's reporting of the injunction couldn't suppress the story. 3 days after the super injunction came into effect, the findings of the internal commission were out on WikiLeaks.
The thing that WikiLeaks does that mainstream media can't do is it can publish pretty much anything, the sort of thing that would get you shut down as a newspaper in many countries. It's not worried about that because, in effect, it's trying to be an internet publisher with no particular base, whereas mainstream media organisations tend to be a sitting target.
The reason WikiLeaks can publish as freely as it does is down to its smart and strategic use of servers spread around the world. The main servers sit in Sweden and Belgium, and all submissions to the site are routed through them. WikiLeaks guarantees anonymity to its contributors based on the strong source protection laws in these two countries. Also, the site uses what it calls mirror servers in other countries, so that shutting down one server doesn't mean the website goes offline completely. The material comes to WikiLeaks through a variety of methods, both high-tech and low-tech.
We received many documents from online uploads through an untraceable encrypted service that we run on the internet. We also receive material in the post for those people who are not sure whether they can secure their internet communications or not.
But that's certainly an important thing that WikiLeaks does have to focus on, is making sure that there's no means by which someone submitting data to it, someone who's whistleblowing, can be traced back, because for some people that could be a matter of life and death.
Protecting its sources is a crucial consideration for WikiLeaks, but given the explosive nature of the content it publishes, an equally important consideration is protecting itself from legal attacks that could get the website shut down. But despite its complex technical and legal arrangements, WikiLeaks has found itself in court frequently.
We have had over 100 attempts to legally threaten us or take us to court. The single largest industry type that tries to attack us is the financial services industry, banks that are trying to conceal dirty business that they're doing.
But what the libel and privacy lawyers couldn't do was done by a funds shortage. At the end of 2009, the site was temporarily shut down for money reasons.
The problem for WikiLeaks is maintaining a constant stream of funding. It's difficult for it to be able to afford the reliable hosting that it needs, and being able to persuade people to fund it when, you never know if the donors might be the sort of people who would actually turn out to be exposing. So it has a challenge in terms of persuading people that it's actually a public good, that there's some benefit in funding it.
It's always a danger that a site like WikiLeaks will be closed down. Other sites that have tried to do the same have been closed down. I can only say that the people involved have been prepared to go to extraordinary length already to keep this material in the public domain. And my feeling is that if they manage to close down WikiLeaks, then something else that rather resembles WikiLeaks will simply pop up elsewhere.
Because in an increasingly litigious media world, what WikiLeaks does is vital. Whether the people in Kenya and in the Ivory Coast are aware of it or not, the website is getting their story out.
More Global Village Voices now on WikiLeaks and what it means for journalism.
WikiLeaks is a vital tool for journalists, whistleblowers and freedom of speech. They're able to publish information that most media outlets couldn't for fear of legal ramifications. Here in the UK, there is the Official Secrets Act, for example, which bars the media from reporting on certain sensitive information.
It is an anti-power that has to stay marginal of any institutionalization. Besides, it is a very precious tool in the hands of newsmen worldwide.
The very concept of WikiLeaks and the possibility of places like Iceland being safe havens means that while the rich enjoy tax havens, one day the oppressed may enjoy information havens.
Finally, one of the problems with 24-hour TV news has to do with supply and demand. Even though the supply of news stories can sometimes dry up when no news is happening, the demands of the 24-hour news cycle never do. And when demand outstrips supply, stories that aren't really news are then covered to fill the on-air void. Now, the people at theonion.com, the satirical U.S. website, have a word for that kind of story. We've had to bleep that word 9 times in our web video of the week, but you'll figure it out. See you next time at The Listening Post.
And now, in a desperate attempt to fill 24 hours of programming, here's some bullshit that happened somewhere today. We've got some footage here of the bullshit, which began just after 3 o'clock this afternoon, when residents in this neighborhood were shocked to see this fairly common thing happening. An attractive witness described the event in breathless terms.
I went to my window and I was like, whoa, there's some bullshit happening.
That happened right over there. I'm an older man, so you can trust what I say.
Authorities in special uniforms rushed to the scene to stand around while our cameras filmed them. Our reporter Keith Collins joins us now live from the scene of the bullshit through the use of expensive technology. Good to be with you again, Keith. We have a colorful graphic here that shows instances of bullshit like this are on the rise. Is that right?
Yes, although why is unclear. I talked to this random expert on the subject who told me this thing you're about to hear him say right after he points at a piece of paper.
I spent my entire life attending the nation's most prestigious schools to talk about bullshit like this. I'm really just happy to be on TV.
Now let's see if we can drag this out a little longer.
This bullshit has some broader implications. Here's a list of tips on how to avoid bullshit happening to you.
And here's some footage of Congress.
Yes, I see that.
Well, thank you, Keith. Let us know if there are any updates on this bullshit story from there.
There's no way there will be.
Very good. We'll check back with you in an hour anyway. When we return, we'll look at live footage of a car chase taken from a helicopter and free associate about what's going on.